And it's a related subject. I'm going to talk now about Time magazine for their selection of their Person of the Year as the guardians of the war on truth. I say it's related because Jamal Khashoggi is one of the figures that's on the cover of Time magazine as one of the guardians. In making their selection, Time magazine wrote quote, for taking great risks in pursuit of greater truths, for the imperfect but essential quest for facts that are central to civil discourse, for speaking up and for speaking out. The guardians are the Person of the Year, Time magazine wrote. As we looked at the choices, it became clear that the manipulation and abuse of truth is really the common thread in so many of this year's major stories. This ought to be a time when democracy leaps forward and informed citizenry being essential to self-government. Instead, it's in retreat. And the story of this assault on truth is somewhat paradoxically one of the hardest to tell, end quote. Time magazine wrote in this week's issue, in Annapolis, Maryland, staff of the Capitol newspaper published by Capitol Gazette Communications, which traces its history of telling readers about the events in Maryland to before the American Revolution, pressed on without the 5 colleagues gunned down in their newsroom on June 28th. Still intact, indeed strengthened after the mass shooting, are the bonds of trust and community that for national news outlets have been eroded on strikingly partisan lines never more than this year. I can tell you this, declared Chase Cook, reporter of the Capitol Gazette on that fateful day, we are putting out a damn paper tomorrow. Cook's promise came just a few hours after 5 of his colleagues were killed. The man charged with their murders had been obsessed with the paper since it wrote about its harassment of a high school classmate, part of a routine coverage of local legal proceedings. He made the office a crime scene. To put the damn paper out, staffers set up laptops in the bed of a pickup in a parking garage across the street. When the next edition arrived on schedule, the opinion page was blank, but for the names of the dead. Gerald Fishman, Rob Hassan, John McNamara, Rebecca Smith, Wendy Winters. Beneath their name, written with a goose quill, quote, tomorrow this page will return to its steady purpose of offering our readers informed opinions about the world around them and that they might be better citizens. I must tell you I am very proud of what the Capitol Gazette has done. They continued through very difficult times with the quality reporting and opinion pages that they've been known for a long time, a real treasured institution in our state capitol. One of the 4 Time magazine covers include the journalist of the Capitol Gazette, the Annapolis, Maryland newspaper where 5 employees were murdered by a gunman last June. I spoke about this shooting on the Senate floor last June, and the Senate unanimously adopted Senate Resolution 575, which I authored and which was co-sponsored by all members of the Senate. This Senate resolution commemorates the lives, careers, and service of 5 victims of the Capitol Gazette shooting in Annapolis, honors the survivors of the attack and the families of the victims, and pledges to continue support for their recovery, thanks law enforcement officers and other emergency first responders for their heroic actions, and reaffirms the commitment of the Senate to defending the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Wendy Winters was among the 5 Capitol Gazette employees killed in the June 28th shooting. According to eyewitness accounts from survivors, Wendy armed herself with the closest weapons at hand, her trash and recycling bins, and charged the shooter, shouting for him to stop. It is believed that Wendy's action distracted the shooter enough to enable several of her co-workers to escape. We think of violence against reporters as something that happens in other countries, in war zones and the like, but not here, not in the United States of America. All around the world, reporters work to gather facts, ask questions, and report the news in the spirit of a free, open, and transparent societies and governments that all people deserve. Too often, reporters are harassed, jailed, and even killed simply because of the nature of their work, which often exposes cronyism and corruption. Jason Renazian, a reporter with the Washington Post who was falsely imprisoned in Iran for doing his job as a journalist, had this to say earlier this year. He talks about the attack I referenced in Annapolis, and I quote him, "Mostly I've covered attacks on the media taking place on the other side of the world, usually in countries where the flow of information is restricted or conditions are such that a sense of desperation or political or tribal affiliation can compel individuals to take heinous actions. Writing about a deadly attack that happened less than 30 miles away in an italic town that I recently visited with relatives from overseas is a new experience for me, and I have to say that I don't relish the task. We Americans have certain rights and responsibilities granted to us through the Constitution, which established the rule of law in this country. Freedom of the press is one of those most basic rights and is central to the First Amendment of the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. This precious freedom has often been under attack, figuratively speaking, since our nation's founding. Today, attacks on the American media have become more frequent and more literal, spurred on by dangerous rhetoric that has created an open season on harassing the media for doing its job, asking the questions that need to be asked, investigating the stories that need to be uncovered, and bringing needed transparency to the halls of power, whether they're in Annapolis, Washington, D.C., or elsewhere. Then candidate and now President Donald Trump's rhetoric, calling the media a stain on America and the enemy of the American people, certainly has caused damage. At the Veterans of Foreign War, the president said to the audience, "They are not to believe what you see and hear." The President of the United States told the crowd of veterans, "Stick with us. Don't believe the crap you see from these people, the fake news. What you're seeing and what you're reading is not happening." That is the President of the United States saying those comments again, demeaning the press and the importance of the free press. Why is the President doing this? Earlier this year, CBS 60 Minutes correspondent Leslie Stahl, an iconic in the news business, shared comments from President Trump from interviews she did with him soon after the 2016 election win. Stahl recalled that she said to Donald Trump about his attacks on the media, "Why are you doing this? You're doing it over and over. It's boring and it's time to end this." The candidate's response was straightforward and shocking. He said, "You know why I do it? I do it to discredit you all, and demean you all, so when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you." Let that sink in for a moment. A man who was about to assume the position of President of the United States explicitly acknowledging he was purposely working to diminish the integrity of the free press. After the Capitol Gazette shooting, Donald Trump said that journalists, like all Americans, should be free from the fear of being violently attacked while doing their job. But how do we interpret his sincerity when more frequently he's calling the media fake news or totally unhinged and telling the American people and the world that reporters are truly bad people? Donald Trump's constant dismissal needs to end. He needs to accept the one of the press's most important roles to speak truth to power, including that to the President of the United States. Here at home, we're left to wonder whether Donald Trump is more inclined to agree with Russian President Vladimir Putin's view of the press, where journalists are routinely jailed and physically attacked, than Thomas Jefferson, who famously said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or a newspaper without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Journalists, like all Americans, should be free from the fear of being violently attacked while doing their job, both figuratively and literally. The right of journalists to report the news is nothing less than the right of all of us to know. Media freedom and media pluralism are essential for the expression of and ensuring respect for other fundamental freedoms and safeguarding democracy, the rule of law, and a system of checks and balances. Every one of us in this body, Democrats and Republicans, have sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. As leaders of this great nation, we have a responsibility to defend the rights of our citizens, including the freedom of press. Time magazine featured 3 covers in addition to the Capitol Gazette. One is Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post contributor who was killed at the Saudi Arabian consul in Istanbul in October. I would note that this is the first time Time Person of the Year is a deceased person. The United States of America must stand up for justice and human rights at home and abroad. I agree that Saudi Arabia is a strong ally and in a variety of important areas, but that should only strengthen their understanding of America's commitment to the rule of law and that we as a nation cannot sanction extrajudicial killings. America's national security is harmed, not helped, when dictators and strongmen believe they can get away with such heinous actions as killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Congress must act to demand accountability for those responsible for Jamal Khashoggi's murder and to send the right signal to the world that America will continue to be a beacon of justice and defender of human rights. Another cover feature Wa Lone and Jol So-u, 2 Reuters journalists who were arrested 1 year ago in Myanmar while they were working on stories about the killings of the Rohingya Muslims. These journalists remain behind bars, but their wives were photographed for the cover. From this floor, I stood in solidarity with the reporters who were detained in Burma for shining a light on the horrific abuses that occur in the Rakhine state. I have stood in solidarity with Ethiopian journalists and bloggers who are routinely arrested for criticizing the Ethiopian government and exposing human rights abuses in that country. I've talked frequently about China, a country that engages in routine censorship and online blocking, harassment, reprisals, and detention of journalists, and visa delays and denials for journalists. Another Time cover shows Maria Ressa, the chief executive of the Philippines news website Rappler, who was indicted on tax evasion charges by President Duterte's administration as part of a crackdown on free speech and dissent. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, an independent nonprofit organization that promotes press freedom worldwide, more than 600 journalists and media workers have been killed in the last 10 years while doing their jobs. Of the member states of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Russia remains the deadliest country for journalists. Turkey is the largest jailer of journalists in the world, and scores of media outlets have been closed since the attempted coup there. The heavy-handed measures used against media freedom in Turkey, both before and during the recent elections, illustrate the length to which the government went to control the information available to voters. It also serves as a reminder of the essential role of pluralist media for free and fair elections. Mr. President, I have also worked on many other countries that have infringed upon the freedom of press in my role on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the ranking Democrat on the Helsinki Commission. I could give you examples of what we've done in Malta, what we've done in Slovakia, what we've done in Belarus, and the list goes on and on and on. I therefore ask the Trump administration and my colleagues in the Senate to redouble their efforts to protect the freedom of the press both at home and abroad. We must lead by example as the very foundation and legitimacy of a democratic republic is at stake. America's leadership is essential to protect the freedom of press, an essential institution for a democratic state. We must lead by first setting an example by our commitment to the freedom of press here at home. We must demand that freedom of the press be a priority in our global affairs, recognizing its importance to our national security. Mr. President, Time magazine got it right by naming the Guardians and the War on Truth as Persons of the Year. With that, I yield the floor.